This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Make your next move with American Express Business Platinum. You'll get 5 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Plus, enjoy access to the American Express Global Lounge Collection. And with the welcome offer of 150,000 points, your business can soar to all new heights. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum. Amex Business Platinum. Built for business by American Express.
Don't you love it when things are both easier and more affordable? Like when the rain washes your car for you. Or like when you save up to 10% by bundling your renters and auto insurance with USAA. Bundle with USAA and start saving. Get a quote today.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I am delighted to be joined by a producer, a legendary producer, Sandy Lieberson. He is a man whose career has stretched over 6 decades, beginning in the 60s when he was an agent and moving to Europe, where he collaborated with some of the biggest names in European cinema and some of my personal favorites. I'm sure we'll get into that. At the moment, we're talking because there is a new book, Hollywood on the Tiber, which is coming out, and Sandy has written the introduction to that book, so we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Sandy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for asking me. I'm happy to be here.
First of all, I want to talk about your beginnings in the industry. You were an agent to some quite high-powered players, right?
Well, yeah, I guess you could call them high-powered, yeah. Definitely.
The ones that sort of popped out to me were figures like Peter Sellers, someone who, having read the Roger Lewis biography, I think that must have been a heck.
Well, he was one of the main reasons I decided to stop being an agent, actually. He was driving me nuts. You know, phone calls at 3 or 4 in the morning and rants and completely unpredictable personality. So, yeah, he was one of the motivators to move into producing. And listen, you put up with somebody like Peter Sellers because you admire them. I believed in, he was a genius as far as acting and creating characters and his screen persona. But off screen, he was a nightmare, so insecure and paranoid. And yeah, but I guess you would, classify him as a personality disorder. In this current time, in those days, he was just walked around like a normal person.
And people sort of seem to have bent like willows around him because I don't know, it's marvelous how much people get away with. And then you look at the news today and you see not much has changed.
Well, I think, life goes on. It's the same industry which creates stars and international personalities, and with that comes a lot of baggage as well. So it's an evolving industry, but interestingly enough, fundamentally, the kind of personalities that run it haven't changed a lot.
And so when you made the move from being an agent to being a producer, was that a relatively easy transition, or was that what were the challenges involved?
Well, first of all, was to give up my profession, which was representing talent, and I loved doing that. I think the reason I was attracted particularly to actors who are so vulnerable in creating personas on screen and what they're called on to do. So I'm really attracted to those kind of people. So it was giving up those relationships and that I built up over years and moving into another area. And it was I didn't feel frightened about it. I felt very excited about it because I found something, a piece of material, a screenplay writer, directors, etc., cast Mick Jagger that I wanted to work with. And I felt that this could be an exciting entry into producing and, maybe prove challenging. Yeah.
So this was the film that you produced with Nick Rogue and Douglas Camel directing?
Donald
Camel, sorry, apologies. Performance, which has to be it has to be in my top 20 of all time films. I mean, I think I've got maybe 2 or 3 Nick Rogue films in there, so they tend to rotate a little bit in and out, but that's an amazing film. But the production of that has sort of gone down as quite tricky, right?
I think all films are tricky to produce.
Sure.
Some films are more tricky than others to produce. And in this, we had very strong personalities. Jagger was his first time as an actor, although he was an actor as a performer in a way, but as an actor. And Donald had a strong vision of the film he wanted to make, as did Nick Rogue. And they collaborated brilliantly, but it was full of strong personalities and some finding their footing and finding their way, others more attuned to filmmaking. So it was an exciting and challenging venture, yeah, but I thought it was worth it. So that was what moved me into the producing.
Were you already did you already know Mick Jagger from representing the Rolling Stones then? Was that the sort of bridge that led you there, or was it the script, or what was the thing that sort of got you in there?
Well, I was representing the Rolling Stones for film and television. We had done the first production together, Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. Mick wanted to move into acting as well. So he and Donald met and they became good friends. And then Donald suggested that we consider having Nick Rogue involved as the cinematographer and co-director. And so we met, we discussed it. It was added complications. Warner Brothers, of course, resisted the idea of people co-directing. Remember, this was in the 60s. Before all these brother acts started co-directing sci-fi and other kinds of films. So it was a novel suggestion, something that hadn't been used frequently in cinema, co-directors. But it worked fantastically well. They each had their area of responsibility, but overlapped. Nick, of course, as a cinematographer, knew what he wanted to bring to the film in terms of the colors, the style, the concept of the photography. And Donald, of course, came with the actors and having written the screenplay. So it was a good and fantastic relationship, and it worked really well. So the making of it was relatively simple. It was all shot in London, all location. Maybe 5% of it might have been inside a studio for some pickups and close-ups and things like that. But otherwise, it was all location movie, all over London. And London in the 60s still hadn't exploded in terms of population expansion. Now, to shoot a film in London is a nightmare. Then we moved freely through the city, getting the locations we wanted, etc. So, the production of it went fine, except Warner's hated the rushes. They really didn't like the film once they saw it. And of course, that created problems.
What were they kind of expecting? Were they expecting something more sort of rock and rolly, or what was I
think they were expecting something more rock and rolly, in tune with Jagger and the Stones audience, etc. And that wasn't the concept of the movie at all. The movie was something else, quite different. Yes, it incorporated rock and roll and the real use of music in the film, but nonetheless, it wasn't a rock and roll movie.
Yeah, it's such a great movie to watch, because I think it feels like it's one of those 60s movies that doesn't, it's not, those 60s movies can feel very, very dated, and yet this feels like it speaks to the 80s and the 70s and the 60s as well. You know, you have a sort of punkish character in there with James Fox's gangster, and it transcends its moment.
Yeah, I think, what we did with performances in terms of being more experimental, and certainly in English language cinema, of being more experimental in terms of storytelling and stylistically approaching what a film's going to be like. So I think a lot of what we did back then has just worked its way into the system and is just part of filmmaking now. So it's, I think it pushed a few boundaries, but listen, that's what cinema was all about. At least that's what it attracted me to the idea of producing.
It's interesting that you say that about world cinema as well, because you were in Europe. You'd previously represented Sergio Leone, so you were very open to, and we're going to talk in a little while about what was going on in Italy as well. There feels like there was a more, I don't know, I don't want to make too many comparisons because it's very easy to sound like an idiot when you do, but it feels like there was this openness to international cinema that still survives. But I'm thinking of a time when the French New Wave had just happened. You had people like Bergman and Kurosawa being household names. There seemed to be people going to the cinema to see these movies more frequently.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Of course, particularly in France, the French New Wave certainly had a profound effect on Camel, who had lived in Paris for a number of years, and certainly with Nick. You know, we worked with Francois Truffaut and other European filmmakers. So there was an appreciation of what was happening in terms of European cinema, the French New Wave, Italian neorealism, what was happening in Germany as well. It definitely had a profound influence on their approach to cinema, stylistically and in many other ways as well. It did, but they weren't frightened to admit that. They embraced it, with reference, their inspirations rather than pretending this was solely their interpretation of cinema. So it was an exciting period. I think one of the most, it was a breakthrough era, post-World War II, cinema of the 60s. It looked different. There were different subjects, different ways of interpreting films. It was an incredible creative period in world cinema. I went to work in Rome in 1961 as an agent. I worked in Hollywood as an agent, and the company I worked with, a man called Phil Gersh, who brilliant guy, and he represented most of the Hollywood blacklisted, communist writers and directors and actors. And so a lot of our business was being done in Europe because that's where they worked. But it wasn't only, blacklisted people, and Robert Wise and directors like that, Phil Carlson. And so I came in contact with one of the agencies in Rome that we work with, Kaufman and Lerner, two Americans who had opened the agency in the 50s, I guess. And I was intrigued about I'd never been to Europe, and I was intrigued about the films they were making and the kind of importance of culturally what was going on in Europe. And so I asked them for a job working in Rome, and they said yes. And I talked it over with Phil Gersh, and he said he was happy, and it meant I could continue representing those clients in Europe for them. And it was, a real adventure. I learned to speak Italian, write and read Italian, and it was a great time for me, Italy, that period.
And so at this period, you sort of had a ground level view of one of the most exciting periods in Italian cinema as well.
Yeah, yes, it was. When you're working with Fellini and Visconti and Bertolucci and people of that caliber, as well as the great comedians, Alberto Sordi and people like that. So Italian cinema wasn't just one kind of cinema. It wasn't only, that period. It also used the more popular aspects of cinema as well, too. So it was a combination of the two things, and they coexisted together.
I really loved. I recently watched The White Sheikh with a Fellini film with Alberto Sordi. Has a relatively small part, it has to be said, but it's just I do like the Fellini films like I Vitelloni and The White Sheikh, which have that sort of comic popular element to them.
Yeah, and part of it was a satire of society and of certain personalities, and Fellini was always doing that. So yes, I think there was always this element of satirical humor and comedy that had a flavor in terms of mainstream, dramatic cinema.
So this was the period that was coined Hollywood on the Tiber, and I think that was one of your employers that coined this phrase, right?
Yeah, Hank Kaufman and Gene Lerner, these are the two Americans that I referred to who started the agency, and they wrote the book together. They stopped being agents in the, I would say the mid 60s. They gave it up. They were older people then, and they didn't want to continue. But they collaborated on this book, which was a picture of what Italy and what international cinema was all about, and what the personalities involved, etc. Not just their clients, but the creative community in Rome. And there was a huge influx of American and British and European talent into Rome. It was a very international kind of cinema. They were very good co-producers of cinema. So it was a glorious period for Italian cinema. And I was lucky to be there and be part of it and see it happening. And it would also expose me to a different way of working. I think American cinema is a much more industrialized process. And I think that's the heritage of the major studios, Warner Brothers and MGM and 20th Century Fox. They worked in a very hierarchical way and a very industrial way. And the Italian cinema in particular was a much looser kind of cinema. First of all, the idea of collaboration existed on all levels. Fellini would always work with two or three writers. He would work with the same cinematographer for many films, but then others as well. And so there was this cross-fertilization of collaboration on every level. And you think that these, these are genius filmmakers and they must be so autocratic and dogmatic about the vision they have for making a film. But it wasn't in that. There was a sense of collaboration between the writers, the directors, and even the producers got a little look in. So I love that process. And that wasn't what, Hollywood was built on. As I say, it was it's an industry and you do things in a much more sort of formulaic way. This is what was exciting about Italian cinema.
Who were you sort of most excited to be working with, sort of on a sort of close up to have a proper view of them working?
I mean, who were we representing?
Yeah, who were you getting close to and were able to sort of see in the process of making films and have that opportunity to see them close up?
I was lucky enough to get to work with all of them in the sense that I was an agent representing talent that these filmmakers wanted to, one example was Susan Strasberg that Giulio Pontecorvo was making a film about the first film about what life inside a concentration camp was from the perspective of somebody called Kapo, K-A-P-O. And that was the word that was used to describe. They had Jewish kapos that actually had to carry out the work for the Nazis. And so this was from the capo's perspective and his fascination with this young Jewish prisoner in the concentration camp. He wanted Susan Strasberg for the role. And Hank Kaufman got on a plane, went to New York, got a hold of Strasberg, had to speak to her father, and agreed to do it. And she was in the film and was absolutely brilliant. So the agents played, a really important part in Italian development of international Italian cinema. And then, of course, you had the De Laurentises and Carlo Ponti and people like that who became international producers as well. So it was very open to that.
It's a really interesting period as well for the fact that you'd have Italian directors making films and getting stars from Hollywood in. And I mean, obviously, one of the most obvious examples of that is Sergio Leone getting Clint Eastwood to come and star in these westerns that he was making while he was on a break from Rawhide. So that sort of cross-pollination isn't quite as doesn't work quite. I mean, I suppose you get people like Yorgos Lanthimos making English language films now, but it's not quite the same thing as going to Rome and filming, or in the case of Leone, going to Spain and filming these movies. It doesn't seem there's that same movement happening.
Well, yes, but you have to remember that the reason you went to Spain was to get a Western look.
Yes, true.
Yeah, so it was, but of course it was also a Spanish co-production, and the Italian film industry was built on co-productions. So you had these American Westerns being shot in Spain by an Italian director and production company. That is an interesting combination.
I mean, Marisol the Mexican is played by a German actress as well, I think, if I remember rightly.
Yes, yeah. Precisely. So, yeah, the casting was exciting. It was international, and you could, Also, you have to remember that films were dubbed in that era, so that the American movies, when they came to Italy, they weren't seen in the American language version. They were seen as dubbed into Italian, and that persisted right up until, I don't know, a decade ago, really.
Oh no, still today. I live in Italy, and it's I can go and see the original language version of a film on a Monday at my local cinema, but other than that, it's all dubbed.
Well, my local Italian cinema plays dubbed movies as well. Yeah.
Where are you based? Where are you based now, Sandy?
Sorry.
Where are you based now? Are you in Rome?
I've had a house in Italy for a long time in Piemonte area, not far from Torino, about an hour's drive.
Oh, wonderful city! I love Torino. Love
Great.
it.
Amazing to have discovered it.
Yeah. They've just had a wonderful festival, a month or so ago, with a great Marlon Brando season.
There's a good Marlon Brando story in Hollywood on the Tiber.
Oh, do tell.
No, you got to read it to find out. It's being published in January. And Paul Cronin, who's the publisher, specializes in really interesting offbeat film books, is publishing it. So it's coming out. It'll be illustrated with some great photos. And I think very, very funny, very exciting, and very revealing. I thought one of the most poignant moments I'd ever experienced was Anna Mignotti wanted to meet Ava Gardner. She admired her for years and was just struck by her beauty. and the meeting of the two actresses, which is captured by Hank and Jean. They were there, they organized it. It's just worth the price of the book alone. It's so emotional and touching, So that's coming up.
If it was Hank who coined the phrase, I'm not sure if it was Hank or Jean, but they sort of regretted to some degree some of the effects that Hollywood had on Italian domestic cinema. That there was I'm not sure if it was a flattening or the model for making films became influenced by Hollywood at a certain point. Do you agree with that, or do you think that was maybe, I don't know, overstating the case?
I think it's an evolution. I think it's an evolutionary process. And I think they felt so strongly about Italian and European cinema, its independence, its integrity, its bravery in terms of subject matter and all of that. And they felt there was a certain corruption of this European type of cinema that wasn't beholden to control of a few people. It was a much more democratic process. So they believed in that, and they believed that the American influence in some way compromised the integrity of European cinema. Guys, listen, if you're a producer, you want to get your film distributed by a big company worldwide, and if you got to make compromises and changes in order to get that, then you make them and you do it, or not, as the case may be. A lot of people refuse to compromise, and so it was a time where this, because you have to remember, Italy had been right alongside Adolf Hitler. Mussolini and Hitler were great patriots. And so Italy had to, in some way, absolve itself from the extermination camps and all of this horror of World War II. And one of the ways was becoming a communist. And so there was this incredible upsurge of the Communist Party in Italy. It would scare the hell out of the United States. They said, there's books have been written about it now, but they've sent CIA agents to Italy to in some way subvert the Italian government so it didn't go communist. It was a fascinating period. But so it was all of this happening, of trying to rid themselves of their history of having been Hitler's accomplices. And so that influenced subject matter of films, and French went through the same process of finally admitting, yes, they collaborated and they had sign a peace treaty and a truce with Adolf Hitler. And so both, I think, countries had to undergo. It went very much quicker and deeper in Italy and in France, where they really didn't want to acknowledge, their collaborations. Finally, it happened, and it became a focus and subject matter for films in Italy. In France.
Yeah, it makes me think of some of the great directors and their internal contradictions, like Luchino Visconti, and sort of being an aristocrat on one level and also a communist on another, or Pasolini and his sort of Marxism / Catholicism, and all combined with his sexuality as well, and just remarkable characters, remarkable personalities, really. And also that personality that Pasolini certainly had of the public intellectual, which, again, today I look far and wide to see a similar figure being accorded the same space on the airwaves.
Yeah, I guess it does happen periodically, but it happened more often with that generation of filmmaker. But I think, you have to also bear in mind what was happening in Europe. I remember when I first came to Europe, I came via London because Richard Harris, the actor, was a client of mine. And I wanted to tell him personally, that I was leaving the States and moving to Europe. And so I spent 5 days in London staying with him and then meeting the young actress and staying with her. And I couldn't believe that there was rationing still going on in England in the 60s. Everything looked as if it had stopped, in the 50s. And there were very few cars. It was impoverished in a way. And there were bomb sites, 10 years later that hadn't been cleared. And it was a shock to an American, young American like myself. We never got bombed in the United States, not until recently. So it felt so strange coming to Europe and realizing what Europe had been through and what it was still going through post-war. So this was a gigantic, in a way, the 60s was a liberation, a break with the old traditions. And it was a birth of rock and roll. And all of a sudden, people began to appreciate the blues and black-orientated music, and it was an incredible period. Lucky to have lived through some of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And survived.
That's an important point to underline.
One of my friends didn't, he play around with drugs, and I was lucky enough to play around with it and leave it. And so many of my contemporaries didn't make it out. They were dropping like flies from overdoses and God knows what other. But that was the period.
Yeah, absolutely. Overindulgence was kind of written into the ethos at a certain point.
I think it was a liberation thing. Fascinating.
Yeah, if you've lived with austerity and rationing, and then suddenly you get into a period of posterity, it's difficult not to. It's like feast and famine in the medieval times.
I saw a film the other day called The Brutalist.
Oh, wonderful film.
Yes, amazing, actually. Amazing film. And of course, one of the most shocking moments of it is this Jewish refugee, a brilliant architect who, was part of the Bauhaus brutalist movement of architecture. He manages to get a visa to come to the United States because his cousin was living there. And very early on, after his arrival, all of a sudden you see him go into the bathroom, and this brilliant architect is shooting up. He's taking heroin, and I hadn't seen that in a film, and how graphic it was presented in a long, long time. It was very interesting to see that this drug culture, it was exploding all over the world.
Yeah, and in that sense, it wasn't sort of like an invention of the 60s. It was something that had been there post-war and was just latent, was just waiting for someone to describe it and bring it out into the open. I mean, it wasn't even illegal, a lot of these drugs, until later.
That's right.
Going back to Europe and producing, and after you've worked in Italy for this period as an agent, what did you think the lessons were that you got from the European style of production that you took into the role yourself?
I think one of the things that struck me the most, but I'd seen a couple of examples that, for me, one of the great characters, people, in Hollywood cinema was Roger Corman. I love the fact that he could spot this, and he was an incredibly educated man. He'd been a Fulbright scholar at Oxford, then went back to the United States, and he made these low budget, a lot of them were pretty, schlocky is a sort of slang word for cheap and cheerful. But they had great talent, Francis Coppola and people like that came, Scorsese, etc. They came from these Corman, no budget movies. They were made for $200,000, $300,000, $500,000. And it was exciting to see. So he was one of my heroes. And it was the same approach in Europe. How much can we get to make this movie? It isn't enough. Oh, it's not enough money. We'll find a way to make it for that. So that in what you can do is adapt. If you have the right material, you can adapt it to make it as cheap as you have to. And I like that spirit of filmmaking. So it isn't lavish. Now, I mean, listen, Brad Pitt, he got $20 million a movie. Timothy Chalamet probably gets $10 million a movie, pretending he's Bob Dylan. So that the cost of movie making is extraordinary. The idea of making low-budget films anymore, well, $5 million is a low-budget movie. But that wasn't my concept of low budget. I came through in an era where you can make a low-budget movie for a couple $100,000 or less, or $50,000. You made it what you could get the budget for. And I love that spirit of filmmaking. That for me is really exciting. I mean, John Cassavetes was an actor that I represented and a brilliant director, and he's a great example of that kind of filmmaking. We'll make the film for what we've got. And it worked, and they knew how to make movies on that level. And I love that. And that inspired me. And it's something I've always felt. Films are ridiculously expensive because of the salaries that people get. They don't really need to get paid that much money. And I like the fact that European cinema now, it's gotten more expensive, but nonetheless, you make these films inexpensively, relatively inexpensively. And they can, The Brutalist, I'm told, I believe it was made for $10 million.
Yeah.
Jesus. That's incredible when you see what the bloated American movies look like these days, overloaded with bullshit. And to see a movie like that made for $10 million, man, that's imagination. There's a filmmaker with imagination.
Yeah, absolutely.
I went to see, because at Fox, I commissioned the Nosferatu, Werner Herzog's movie. And there's an interesting story behind that, I'll tell you. And I loved it. It was made inexpensively. It was a European film. And then I saw Robert Eggers, who I think is a brilliant director, and I saw his version of Nosferatu. And it had a lot more production value than Werner Herzog's version, but it didn't have the edginess of Herzog. The Herzog version in the casting was so brilliantly cast that and Eggers' version didn't have that. So it looked wonderful, but it never, in some ways, delivered in terms of the performances, and I don't know.
Yeah, I love that. I love the Herzog.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely brilliant.
I mean, you've got Kinski, you've got Bruno Ganz, Isabella Allende, and you've got those mountains and the Wagner, and it's just it's a real elemental cinema. You've got a sense of, there's a real power to it, and as you say, like that sense of danger that's there. I haven't seen the Robert Eggers yet, so I can't possibly comment on that. But
it's good. It's a good film, well made, but it didn't have that, for me, that one magical ingredient. Klaus Kinski just became Dracula. He wasn't an actor, and that was his, the beauty of those relationships. You saw that. So it was interesting. Yeah. And the story I wanted to tell you, so we made Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. We made it in 3 languages in a way. It was a French co-production with Gaumont. They came in for part of the money with Fox. So it was Fox English language, Gaumont had France. And we also had a German version as well. And we took the film to Hollywood to preview it. And we went, in those days, they weren't recruited previews. The audience come to see, one movie, and then they got free. They could stay and see and preview a new movie. So you were really experimenting. And we were very open. And so we took Nosferatu, and we had the English language version, and we previewed the English language version. And I thought, Jesus Christ, what is happening? The audience is laughing. And they saw it as a kind of comedy, a comedic film. The cards coming back, describing their reaction to the films were terrible. And there was a really nice guy who was head of distribution at Fox at the time, Ashley Boone. He was the first Black executive in Hollywood, and he was president of marketing. And he said, Sandy, have we got a different version? I think he also made a French version. I said, yeah, we've got a French and Italian version. He said, well, get me the French version, and we'll preview the film again. And we took the film. It was in French with English subtitles, and the audience loved it.
Because they took it seriously with subtitles.
Yeah, they saw it in a different way. They saw it as a French, a French film. And so I think we got a good response, good cards and all that. So it was released as a foreign language movie in the United States. It was funny how you get there,
Wow. I heard from someone, a Chinese producer, that if there's a foreign language movie, like a French movie or an Italian movie in China, they dub it into English and then put subtitles in Cantonese or and the idea is, if you're going to see a foreign language film, you want it to be in English. The audience want it to be in English. So
yeah.
I mean, those films that you were producing in the 70s as well, you produced quite a few talents who they were their first movie making. I'm thinking of Terry Gilliam and Jabberwocky, for instance.
Well, Terry Gilliam was a fellow American in London in the 60s. And I met him. He was an absolutely brilliant character to be around. Mind is just, off in so many different directions. And I loved what they had done with the films that he was involved with, that they called
the Monty Python, yeah.
I love their films and the sense of humor and all that. And Terry, of course, co-direct Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones,
right,
the other member of the Pythons, co-directed the films. And so I said, God, I don't know if they're always going to be co-directing together. And so I approached Terry Gilliam and said, listen, have you ever thought about directing on your own? And his eyes just lit up. He said, yes, I'd love to. And so I said, well, come up with an idea. And he came back to me with Jabberwocky. And he wrote the screenplay, co-wrote the screenplay. We went through the budget really carefully in the casting, and he had a reputation, Terry Gilliam, of being uncontrollable, just so, exuberant and all of that. And so I said, Terry, I just want you to know, I want to go through this budget and the schedule to make sure you can get what we need in the time for the money we've got. So we went through. We spent like 3 or 4 days going through. It was unusual. You don't usually do that with a director. But I just wanted to make sure. And he understood that, and we got a completion guarantee. It was financed independently. We had different distributors involved. And we set out to make the movie. And it was great. We had the most amazing cast of the greatest British comedic actors over covered many generations. And we it was a lot of work, because it's a period, a period medieval film, lots of complications in terms of locations, wardrobe, etc., etc. And we were going at a very fast pace. And the cinematographer, after the third week, came into the office and said, "If we continue at this pace, I'm going to quit." I said, "Well, listen, you better tell that to Terry Gilliam, because he's the reason you're on this film. He wanted you to be the cinematographer." And so the three of us got together in a room, and Terry said, "Listen, I'm going at a pace that I'm happy with." And the cinematographer says, "Well, I'm going to quit then." I thought, shit, in the middle of production. And going on the phone, immediately I called somebody, the cinematographer I knew, Terry Richmond, who worked with Nick Rogue as his operator. And he said he would come if needed. And Terry said, "Listen, if he's going to walk off the film, let him go." And went back to him and said, "This is your moment. Either you're going to stay with the movie, we're not going to change the schedule for you, or leave." And he backed down and he stayed, and he did a really great job. And we finished the film on schedule and on budget. And it looks brilliant, I think. It's one of my favorite films that I produced. And working with a guy like Gilliam, whose imagination knows no bounds in some way, and then he went on to go completely mad on some, over budgets and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to say they really needed you on Brazil and Baron Munchausen and all those films then.
Well, Brazil wasn't too bad. That, went over budget, but it wasn't that far over. But some of the others, Jesus, Munchausen, outrageously over budget. But that's my approach to working with talent, is to be honest with them. Hey, listen, this is what we've got. If you can't do it for that, or it's going to compromise the film, then tell me now. I don't want to have, arguments later. And I like to go through the script with the director to actually go through it page by page, scene by scene, and say, "Hey, what do you feel about this? We've got a lot to cover in this day. So many different setups, et cetera, and talk through it with the filmmaker so that they feel involved in the whole process. Not that it's, you're the producer, I'm the director, and we're at opposite ends of the spectrum. No, I want it to be more of a collaboration so that they understand the constraints of what schedules and budgets mean. And I have to be assured that it's not going to compromise the film, etc. So I like that involvement and like that working relationship with the filmmaker. And it's worked for me as a producer. When I worked at 20th Century Fox or Lad Company, Warner Brothers, etc., it's a different story. You're working for the major companies, and if you come in with that sort of approach to filmmaking, you're going to be at odds with management, who say, "No, you got to pay these people this, you got to do that, you have to spend that amount of money." So in a way, you lose control of the film. Studio, in many ways, takes over in certain aspects of the filmmaking process. It's a different kind of industry. As I say, one's an industry, the other, but they morph together now. They're more reciprocal, I think.
I was going to ask that because, you produced another film in the late 80s, Rita, Sue and Bob 2 for Alan Clark, which again is a brilliant film, really, really wonderful sort of comedy and mixing social realism with comedy in a way which I really, really love. It's based on a great play. I just wonder how you look at, having had those experiences, how you look at sort of the British film industry now and where it is today.
Very, very different. I mean, first of all, you have to remember that, woke industry, WOKE, is a different industry. And nobody can argue it was definitely an underrepresentation in terms of Hollywood cinema of African Americans, of Hispanics, of Orientals. You didn't use Chinese actors. You dressed up the Caucasian actor to try and make him look Chinese. So you had these prejudices in the industry, and they had to be eradicated, and it had to change. But like Hollywood does, it swings from one, side of the pendulum to the other. It doesn't do it in a thought out, a more methodical way. It just leaps to it. So we've had, the past 10 years, a lot, as I say, a lot of it is very healthy. But you're in an industry that is woke, thank God, but it also impacts on the filmmaking process, and it changes what you are making in the way of cinema. I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent about that. I'm not even sure what the question was. But
maybe I was kind of more referring to sort of the British film industry in terms of, like, I look back at, maybe it's slightly to do with that availability bias of what you remember the peaks and you forget the troughs. But I look at Jabberwocky and Rita, Sue and Bob too, and I think, wow, those are two amazing movies and performance, and you look at the British film industry now, and we're making great films. There's no doubt about it. There are great films coming out.
Which ones are you thinking of? I don't see that many. I don't see that many great.
Yeah, I mean, I think last year there was How to Have Sex was I thought was a really well made thriller that used sex as its MacGuffin, if you like. It was a really good point of view of a young woman. Experience. I'm blanking on other British films.
Well, How to Have Sex. I mean, I went to it with a completely open mind, and within the first 10 minutes, I thought, "Go on, these girls they don't look as if they're the age they're playing. They look much too old." To be having sex for the first time. And so I didn't really buy into it. I kind of enjoyed it, and was glad that they were making it, but there was something about it that didn't quite work for me. But anyways, I think it was successful in the UK. I don't know what it did outside that. But I don't know where the great British films are coming from. There's some great British television, but the era of great British films, if you go back to sort of post-World War II, I know a lot of people are saying, oh, God, we have to talk about that. But if you look at that post-war period, in the 60s, Lindsay Anderson, Carol Rice, Jack Clayton, Richard Lester, Dick Lester. I mean, God damn it. British cinema was really exciting. It had something to say. And it said it in a way that it was dramatic and entertaining. They called it kitchen sink drama, I think, because it was about real people and working people and sporting life. Wow, that's what I want to represent. Richard Harris, Lindsay Anderson, what a director he was too. So for me, I don't see that in this current crop. I think I see talented people, but I don't see the films that you're going to remember or in some way really impact you, whether it's comedy. Just think of the Ealing comedies, or think of the Carry On comedies. I mean, you assume Bob too owes a lot to that kind of cinema. And I don't know if your audience even knows about Rita Sue and Bob too, but if they don't, go and see it. You can get it on Amazon or wherever. And Alan Clark was one of the top TV director, and I really believed that he could make a cinema film. And so, we took this subject matter, we assumed Bob too, of one of the worst housing estates in Bradford, and this incredibly talented playwright comes out and writes, Rita Zumba too, and a couple of other plays about her life on the estate. It's all factual, everything that she went through. And I remember when the film was released, we had a couple of really negative reviews saying, "Oh, this is exploiting working class people. This isn't how they behave, etc., etc." And I thought, what the hell are they talking about? This is life on the estate in Bradford. Nothing was, fictionalized at all.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe that's what drew me to it, because I recognize it as a sort of a working class. I come from Barrow-in-Furness, which is a further north than Bradford. And I totally recognized it, maybe more than sometimes some of the more austere more serious social realist films, because it had that raunchiness and that humor that they tend to lack.
I mean, when I got the script, I said, there's only one director that I'll make this with, which was, I said, Alan Clark. He's done some of the most exciting British television I've seen in years. And I think he can make the transition into making this into a film. And I was absolutely right. He was brilliant. Fantastic.
Well, what do you think the problem is with? Because when you talk about that era, that post-war era, and it seems like there's a parallel problem in Italian cinema, although Italian cinema survived maybe much longer before the dip. Is it? I mean, I tend to look at British cinema and there seems to be a lot of great debut films, and then the support drops off for this. Everybody's looking for the great new talent, and then once that arrives, it's like, now you're on your own. It doesn't. I'm not sure if there's is it an infrastructure problem? Is it the talent just isn't there? What's going on?
Well, when I went for public funding, when I started producing, in a lot of the films that I did in partnership with David Putnam, we produced with government funding. The British Film Institute, only it wasn't called the British Film. It was called the British Film Institute, but it was a separate body that dispersed government funding for British cinema. And these were people who said, okay, we like this, we trust you, we trust you. That was something they emphasized. We trust, you are going to make a good film and bring it in on the budget you agreed, and we're going to put some of this government subsidy money into your film. And they didn't tell you to start rewriting your screenplay. They didn't tell you to do this. They didn't tell you to cast this way. They didn't tell you to do that. They let you alone. And you either made your mistakes or you got things right, or it was a combination of the two things, but you went ahead and made the film. And now it's just so prescribed in terms of, yes, you're giving government funding, but you have to go through countless script meetings with the funders. And that can be a very negative process. It's very ageist. So very rarely does anybody, of 50 years old actually get any funding. I think Mike Lee is probably the last person to get government funding in his I guess, early 70s. So it's changed. It's changed its perspective about how funding is distributed and who is distributed to. So you must fulfill a commitment to have, over half of your films have to be made by a gender orientated decision on director. That means that half of the films made have to be made by female directors, which in some ways is a very good thing, and redressing an imbalance that existed. but it's gone so far the other way, so that decisions are made about casting and all that in order to fulfill the gender and social requirements. And in some cases, that's a good thing, a very good thing, because you're giving opportunity to actors and filmmakers before who didn't have the opportunity. But it's gone so far the other way that How to Have Sex can be the best British film of the year. Well, that says something about the year and British cinema. Not that How to Have Sex is a bad film. I'm not saying that. But if that's the best film, what the hell's going on? You know, it's some misreading of, this funding and filmmaking process.
Yeah, and it feels a little bit like British cinema has become like almost purely art house cinema as well, in the sense that it will be put in the same screens as the latest French film or Anatomy of a Fall or something like that, versus Hollywood, rather than. I read a statistic. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it's a statistic, so it must be, that like more than half of tickets sold in Italy at cinemas are for domestic films. That people go and see more Italian films than they go. And I think it's by a slim margin. I think it's like 52% are Italian films and the rest are Hollywood films. And that. I don't think Britain's anywhere near that. I don't think most countries are anywhere near that.
I think you're absolutely right. That's a healthy statistic, and it shows you the strength of Italian language and Italian language films. In some ways, Italians are very provincial in the sense that the only language they speak is Italian. In many other European countries, people are multilingual. But that isn't the only reason they're going to see those films. Italian cinema goers are pretty adventurous. They want to see what are considered art house films. And these are films that are widely distributed to the public. They aren't just in one or two cinemas. So I think the cinema audience in Italy is a much more vibrant audience. And they respond to Italian language cinema very strongly. Yeah, I want to say, the big budget Hollywood movies, and the more interesting Hollywood movies too. But they love their own films in their own language. That's a healthy thing, I think.
Yeah, I think it's that thing of they like to recognize what the streets look like. They like to recognize what the interactions look like. They have their own sense of humor. It doesn't necessarily translate to quality. As Cinema Panettone will attest, there's plenty of terrible Italian sex comedies that still do very, very well at the box office. But it is a sign that they get to see. It's like the Italians still have their carry-on films and Britain doesn't. And that's as much as the carry-on films weren't necessarily all that good. There's they served a really good function.
They made you laugh. no matter what class you were, that was a great thing. We went to see these carry-on movies. There would be the English upper class sitting side by side with the British working class enjoying, these romps.
Yeah.
That was wonderful. The carry-on films, I thought.
Yeah, that's the Roger Corman in you, because you love how they made how cheaply they were made. There was a brilliant story about how the Carry On films often followed Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor around and basically made films based on their costumes. So they made Carry On Cleo with Sid James wearing Richard Burton's costume, and they made Carry On Don't Lose Your Head with Anne of a Thousand Days, Richard Burton's costume. And it's just like, that's how they saved money, was Richard Burton cast-offs.
Well, I've got to be honest with you. That's how we made Jabberwocky. We got one of our major sets, was a standing set that had just been used in another film at Shepperton Studios, and we negotiated with the film producers and the studio, and so we used their sets in Jabberwock.
What was the film? What was the?
I forgot the name of it. Sorry, but it was a period film, obviously, and so we used a lot of their sets, which I love that idea. I'm like, God, we've got these, people have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on these sets, and we can get them for £10,000. Isn't that great? Rather than thinking, I've got to, build everything from scratch. No, and Terry Gilliam was like that as well. He loved that, let's cannibalize that and use that to incorporate film.
Absolutely.
I love that kind of filmmaking. I don't know. I'm sort of an anarchist at heart. So
it does go with that. That as you say, your great hero Roger Corman. That improvisation and make do.
Yeah. It isn't. Look at it. Ultimately, it isn't the money you're spending. It's the people are coming to see. They're coming to be able to laugh or cry or get angry or whatever at films, and so what they want.
Well, listen,
but do it in an interesting way.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Sandy, can you remind us of the book and the book that's coming out in January, Hollywood on the Tiber?
Yeah, Hollywood on the Tiber. What it does, it isn't just about the clients, the actors and the directors that we represented at the Kaufman and Lerner agency, but it's Hank Kaufman and Jean Lerner. They give you an incredible picture of what Rome was like. You've got to remember, this is the Rome of Fellini. This is the Rome of Visconti, and the dramas that went on, the sexual scandals that were, because I came from LA, and everything was homosexuality. If you were gay, nobody ever admitted it. Your career would be over. There was no drug taking. Yes, there was a lot of drug taking, but you had to pretend you didn't. It was all open in Rome at that period. It's captured in this book. They're so honest and open about what is going on with these fabulous, you have to remember, there's a most amazing description of the meeting between Fellini and Anita Ekberg for 8.5 La Dolce Vita.
La Dolce Vita,
and it's just hilarious, the meeting. He had to convince her and beg her to be in the film. It's full of these kind of stories, but it's also a very intelligent book because Hank and Jean were intelligent. Jean was a real intellectual and a writer himself. And so there is a real storytelling in the book about Rome, about the period, about the people, not just Italian, but whether it was Andalone and Romy Schneider or whoever, it's European cinema, but it's based in Rome, of course. And when I first read it before it was published, I thought, God, they really captured it in this book. And so now, finally, it is going to be published in English I believe it's January. And, I think it's great. I love them.
Excellent. I can't wait to read it. I know Paul Cronin has sent me a copy. It's currently winging its way across the Brexit divide which is not as easy as it used to be to get to Italy. But anyway, it's on its way. So I can't wait to read it, and I will give a little review of it when it does arrive. But I really wanted to thank you, Sandy, for agreeing to talk to me. It's been a really fun conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Will, talk to me.
ABC Tuesdays.
They took his daughter. She's coming home alive.
Will Trent, the series critics are calling powerful must-see TV, continues to thrill.
Shouldn't we strategize before we go in there?
If we screw up this case, a cop killer walks free.
With its most dramatic and heart-racing season yet.
GBI!
Help me!
Get down!
Will Trent, all new Tuesdays on ABC and stream on Hulu.